Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the People and Dancefloors podcast. I'm so excited today about my guest. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Julia.
So we have Juan Fernandez Ochoa, who is a currently campaigns and communication manager at the International Drug Policy Consortium, which is a UK-based charity, but doing international work. And specifically, he leads on the Support Don't Punish campaign. I see you've got a poster there in the background, and which is a long-standing campaign that focuses on reducing harms and supporting people who use drugs rather than punishment and sort of disciplinarian and punitive solutions um, to drug policy. And I think you've been in the field quite a while. You've got experience before with the Beckley Foundation, as well as DrugScience. And yeah, I mean, tell me more about yourself. Tell me more about how you ended up working in this field.
Yeah, sure. Thank you first so much, Julia, for inviting me to this People on Dance Floors podcast. I've been following the project for a while, and it's incredibly exciting. So yeah, really happy to be here and share a little bit of my perspective and experience. So I was born in Venezuela, and so when I finished my studies in London, in political science. And as you say, I've been working for almost 6 years for the International Drug Policy Consortium. Before, I was policy officer at Beckley, and I started actually volunteering in the sector with DrugScience, which was at the time the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, which was founded by David Nutt after sort of the whole debacle of his sort of untimely sacking from the ACMD. Um, I think I landed in this sector for a few reasons, and I think the first one is that as I said, I grew up in Venezuela, and so drug-related issues are sort of unavoidable. And even though while I was growing up, I think I was very much sheltered from issues related to drugs, and so I didn't think too much about these issues. As soon as I left the country, I realized that my country was perceived as sort of like a transit point for cocaine routes that come into Europe. And I started realizing sort of the role that drugs play as a means of sustenance for a lot of people in my country, but also as the source of a lot of punishment for people in my country. And I was really interested whilst I was doing my studies in cooperation between Andean countries. Part of my family is from the Andes, so I think in a way I was also trying to connect with that part of my background. Um, and I found myself in uni in my fourth year with many other sort of friends who were also half Latin American, or fully Latin American and half European, so European and Latin American, thinking, do we know enough about drugs? Like, have we been told these, have we been given the information, enough information to understand the situation of our countries in relation to these markets and this phenomenon? And so we started a project as university students, just sharing. At the time, it was just like sharing facts. We thought that was how change happened, just like sharing facts, because we hadn't been given that information. So it was called Rethinking Drug Policy, and we glued posters on walls and notice boards, and I think that's when I really started falling in love with this issue, because the more we did things, the more I realized I also didn't know enough, and there was more to discover. And I definitely feel like after all these years, this was 2011, or 2010 actually. I'm still very much learning and still changing, and my perspective continues to change. So I think this is something that has attracted me to the sector, the fact that there's so much to discover and so much to learn and unlearn.
I mean, if only sharing facts was was enough. But no, I love that. I love the fact that as students you were like trying to come together to like like challenge and inform yourselves and like challenge other people. But as you say, it's such a massively complex and forever giving sort of field, and the changes, but not just the changes, but also in order to understand the ways in which drugs are layered and involved in not just at the individual level, but in terms of markets, in terms of politics, in terms of banking. There's all sorts of different, I think, avenues that can be explored. And I certainly, I'm been in the field for about 10 years myself, and I still don't know anything. so yeah. And I think one thing that I find interesting in terms of the conversations that we've had in the past, but also in terms of the idea of the International Drug Policy Consortium as an entity, is that it is its kind of international nature, and the idea that this is an international issue. It's not just about UK policy. It's not just about what happens here, but everything is connected. It's a global issue. It's a global market, so that that whatever happens in one place has an effect in another place, and vice versa. And I think too often, especially as academics, charities, organizations that operate in the UK, we kind of get a bit obsessed with like, oh, what's happening in the UK, or what's happening in the global north, what's happening in the US. And we kind of forget that there are obviously really interesting developments going on elsewhere, particularly in the global south, which we tend to really talk less about. So I'm wondering whether you can maybe recall some of your favorite developments in recent times that you want to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I love this question, actually. And I think it's a very important question. As you say, international drug control, the global drug control regime is by definition a global international apparatus of norms and practices and a lot of violence. And part of the advent of this apparatus was the responsibility of the UK. So I feel like there is a sense of duty for people who are working in drug policy and everyone in the UK to realize that colonial history. And on that note, I'll tell you an anecdote, and I hope it's received with the love with which it's intended. But I found myself about 4 years ago in a conference in the UK about harm reduction. It's a conference that I, in general, absolutely love. And there was a panel on legal regulation. And so they talked about Colorado. We're talking about the moves in California, about projects in New York. And that was it. Like we talked about the United States, and I was very confused. Like, where was Uruguay? Uruguay was like the first full sort of central government sort of statewide, nationwide regulation of cannabis, and I found it so weird that that whole experience had been just left out. And I think if I'm sort of trying to approach that with kindness, I would say that the world of research mirrors the logics of power and distribution of power and wealth that we see between sort of different states in the world. And so Uruguay is, to a great extent, sort of in the peripheries of imperial cause, whereas like Washington is bang on in the middle of one. And so I don't think it's my colleagues were trying to deliberately exclude Uruguay, although I do still think it was an oversight. And I did ask the question at the time, and they talked about like barriers in language. But I think there's something to be said about how the production of academic knowledge is very much embedded in these sort of broader power structures, and that conditions what knowledge is and what experiences matter elsewhere. And so in that regard, I think there's an interesting move in drug policy reform and in harm reduction to engage with concepts like colonialism and decoloniality, and try to undo the impact of colonialism also in our practice, in our rhetoric, in the way we make demands. And so that's very positive. So just that to set the stage. Now, in terms of what I find particularly exciting, as you said earlier, I'm very lucky to work with Support on Punish, with local partners. Last year, the Global Day of Action saw activities in 261 cities of 98 countries. And there's been activities taking place in over 100 countries. So I feel incredibly fortunate to sort of sit to a certain extent in the middle of this and have access to all those experiences and all that beauty and power that local partners are sort of making happen and sort of embodying. And also, like, through IDPC is a network of 195 organizations in 75 countries. So I get to experience a lot of interesting moves that would otherwise perhaps not be as available to me. And if I had to mention a few, I can think of, for example, Echele Cabeza, which is a project in Colombia. They do drug checking, but they also do outreach, but they also do education. And I think that combination of like changing, because they also do political advocacy. So like merging practice with political advocacy and the provision of care to other people who use drugs. And something to highlight is that this is a project that is mostly carried forward by people who use drugs. So there's something incredibly encouraging and powerful about this. I can think of also in Mexico, for example, colleagues have been for a very long time advocating for an end to the war on drugs, which was officially launched by the Mexican government in 2006. And ever since, we've seen sort of, it has costed, or it has led to around 150,000 deaths and 32,000 disappearances. So it's an incredibly sort of almost unfathomably destructive system of violence in the country. And our colleagues have sort of mobilized through strategic litigation, political advocacy, community mobilization to make it to now where there is a project of legal regulation before the country's Congress. It has been an incredibly difficult sort of tug of war with the powers that be, because they want to insist with quite a capitalistic, quite exploitative, quite exclusionary model of legal regulation. But our colleagues up until today, at MUCD, Mexico United Against Crime, Elementa, DDHH, so human rights, Instituto RIA, they have all mobilized, Reverdecer, of course, they have all mobilized to ensure that up until the very last minute, they're advocating for social equity, to ensure that small farmers from communal lands can access the market, to ensure that the project does not pass or perpetuate the criminalization of people for simple possession. So what they're doing is advocating for the abolition of the offense of simple possession, which I think is absolutely fantastic, and we can learn a lot from that experience. They've also advocated for measures against vertical integration, so to ensure that there's no single corporation that's going to sort of control the whole supply chain, provisions to allow for collective cultivation, so cooperative cultivation. So I think there's something to be learned from that experience about being steadfast and not sort of compromise beforehand, sort of navigate, of course, the challenges of doing this advocacy, but understanding that there are some core principles that we should never relinquish. And I think that is really important. I have 4 more or 5 more that I wanted to mention. One is the Brazilian network of anti-prohibitionist feminists who are constantly organizing panels and also material support for and by criminalized communities. The Bar Hostess Empowerment and Support Program in Kenya, which is a sex worker-led organization that serves sex workers, women who use drugs, bar hostesses, and women who have sex with women. So they provide paralegal services. They do advocacy, they do harm reduction, they provide health services. They have been involved in Support Unpunished, and I am through the Women and Harm Reduction International Network, and I love that sort of cross-sector, struggle cooperation. I can also think of the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs doing absolutely fantastic work in South Africa. IDUCARE, which is also a community-led initiative in the Philippines, sort of organizing people who use drugs to protect each other and ensure each other's health. And finally, I wanted to mention the ongoing experience of Caribbean countries in decriminalizing cannabis. Of course, I believe in full decriminalization, but I think there's something really interesting, especially as we recently saw Barbados and Jamaica discuss the end of the monarchy in these states, also getting rid of these systems of oppression that were imposed to them by British colonialism, and finally enabling the possibility of people using cannabis, which has been sort of rooted in the culture of so many communities in these countries, finally be something that doesn't attract criminality. And there's definitely issues in there, and all these experiences, there's always challenges. And so I know through colleagues that Rastafari and Maroon communities are still struggling with state violence, even post decriminalization. But I think all of these moves give us a flavor of these wonderful experiences that are sort of flourishing everywhere across the globe. And I think drug policy reform is a sector that I'm particularly in love with because of that connectedness between experiences across the globe, and we can definitely make more of that.
Oh, that's so fascinating, and that there's actually so many of the projects that you mentioned in there I didn't know. So I was just like busy, like going like, oh, I need to follow up on this. But also, I keep thinking about this, and I think it relates to the anecdote that you shared about, kind of colonial legacy in research and the kind of dominance of the Anglophone approach and Anglophone knowledge, produced in English, and the focus on Anglophone countries over and above everybody else. And I think what really churns my stomach about it is the fact that often Anglophone countries and global North countries are also the ones that go for the more commercial, individualistic models of policy of drug policy change, and they kind of do away with, or they ignore the more collective non-profit models that tend to be actually more rooted or and more established in maybe Hispanic countries, for example. So yeah, and I have a big beef about that. And so I just I think that it's unfortunate that those are not more, they don't become a more of a focus of discussion in reform, because that basically precludes countries that might want to experiment from going in a different direction than like more purely commercial, or and thinking about values, thinking about principles, thinking about collectivities, thinking about not thinking about profit, So all of the things that obviously I'd like to see as part of the broader drug policy reform trajectory. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I may, Julia, because that is I think it's a very important point. I very often hear colleagues say, "Oh, it's just that those cooperative models of production are not part of our culture in the UK," and I find that really interesting, and because of two things. One, because they may be right. Like in the US and in the UK, when I referred to before as these being countries that were/are still imperial cause, like it's countries that have built their political and economic system out of capitalist exploitation through colonialism, through the spoils of the transatlantic and the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade. So of course, it's countries that have historical ties with certain forms of producing goods, or certain forms of production that are associated with like hyper-capitalistic a hyper-capitalistic ethos. That is true, and where my sympathy with those arguments stops is we as advocacy organizations are here to promote change, not to just accept like that there might be a generalized belief that capitalism is a system of production or an economic system that generates value for the most or justice. So I think there's also a responsibility for us as drug policy advocates to create platforms for voices that oppose that sort of thinking and show people why these models of production, the corporatization of these industries, would ultimately just perpetuate harm. And in saying that, I do want to sort of open the parenthesis that I think the drug policy reform sector, at least where I'm sitting, like I know that like IDPC is a very specific network with a very specific sort of way of understanding this phenomenon. But as an IDPC network, as the IDPC network, we have definitely started already sort of 4 years ago thinking, how do we ensure that the transit from informal markets to formal markets, first, doesn't leave anyone behind, and second, doesn't perpetuate the logics of accumulation that we see in other industries. And so there's a really interesting paper that we produced in 2019 or 20, which is called Principles for the Legal Regulation of Cannabis. And a more recent paper that we co-produced with many other organizations called, I forgot the name, but it's against corporate capture, precisely addressing these worries. So I think we need to continue leaning into this important advocacy to ensure that the nascent industry is not just Coca-Cola or big tobacco, but rather an industry that can support a move towards a fairer society. And I think that's entirely possible and entirely desirable. And of course, learn from, the Spanish experience with cannabis social clubs, the nascent experience of Malta with cannabis social clubs. And yeah, there's definitely plenty to work with.
Definitely. And yeah, I think, I'm going to put the links to the documents and the reports, or the documents that you mentioned, so that people can access them. Yeah, thinking about this kind of culture excuse, it's like, well, yeah, you might well be limited by the kind of culture that you have assimilated and you've been brought up in, but at the same time, you know it doesn't mean that things can't change, and it doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge that some aspects of this culture are like deeply problematic, and they come from a history of exploitation. So what do? They just keep going in the same direction. And like sometimes, I've spoken to maybe more liberal, or more kind of people who are more interested in commercial models, saying that that sometimes kind of commercial models can drive innovation in terms of product differentiation and kind of ability, offerings to the consumer, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, maybe, but then at the same time, can you not just, if you invested in research and you did it based on a different model, you don't need like commercial individualism to be able to have innovation in products. Like, I don't know, maybe I feel like just because this is the way it's been done up to this point doesn't mean that we have to continue doing it the same way.
Not completely agree. And there's something really, there's a paper waiting to be written, and I've really I've had this in mind for at least 2 years about writing a paper of why. So my grandparents in Spain left poverty partially because of their involvement in cooperative systems of production of wine, another drug. And if you, at a certain point in Spain, at the height of the cooperative wine production via cooperatives in Spain, they accounted for about 80 or 90% of the market, which is huge. And then you see the cooperative movement sort of wane with the opening of borders, globalization, and sort of free market reforms that were associated with joining the European Union. And when you hear what people report were the causes of that demise, it's about what you were saying, about like a lack of funding to engage in good marketing, lack of funding into research and innovation. I don't think that is inevitable. Like if we create economies that support like these cooperative businesses thriving, then we will see them thriving. If we create space for sort of exploitative endeavors to basically cannibalize the market and absorb the market share of those smaller players that maybe, yes, do not have the same resources because it is impossible to, it is a David and Goliath situation, right? Like where you have one system of production that is based on accumulation and exploitation and another one that's way more collective but doesn't have the possibility of creating profit in the same way. If you put them in competition, I think the result will inevitably be the demise of cooperative actors. So what I think should be done is provide ample support for cooperative business to develop into fully fledged functioning systems of production. But yeah, that's a very long conversation that I hope continues to happen.
Definitely, and I think it's it's very much the same in the Italian context, where I'm from, and I think you can see that the very same patterns happening, and cooperative businesses being completely decimated, having been the kind of the pride and joy, I think, of the Italian system for a time. So anyway, yes, conversation for another day.
Let's go write that paper, Julia.
Yes, let's do it. I mean, the next question was about whether you think there have been very concerning developments of late in the drugs field.
Yeah, I'll add a caveat here, and it's that I live concerned. Like I'm a bundle of worries, and I have a lot of thoughts about why that's the case. But yeah, I'm very worried in general. I'm very hopeful also, but anyways. No, when I think of worrying trends, I think it's always my reflex is always to start inward. So if I have to think of critiques of what I see in drug policy or the harm reduction movement, like the first place where I look is what's around me, because I think it's important. Like critique is incredibly important to keep our eyes on the prize and on our ultimate north. And so I think my biggest worry is about siloing and compartmentalization. I think this is sort of inevitable because of the logics. To a certain extent, it's inevitable because of the logics of NGOs. Like we sort of have limited resources to focus on specific issues. So sometimes NGOs can over-focus on specific issues and forget the context. Now, when it comes to drugs, I think it's such a broad issue with so many ramifications that I think this becomes harder. And I'm glad that this is the case, that sort of over specific thinking is rare, at least among my colleagues. But it does happen. And as moves towards cannabis legalization sort of prosper, we have seen cannabis legalization outfits and people who advocate for cannabis legalization belittle opiate drug users, for example, which for me is absolutely heartbreaking and intolerable. And we need to be very careful against this sort of hierarchy of drug use. I think something that's incredibly powerful in the drug user movement is that we are incredibly different people of, completely, there's very little that unites us if you think about it, because we have such different life experiences, and yet we come together in solidarity with each other. I think that's incredibly beautiful. Like the fact that the drug user movement creates space for people in incredibly different conditions and with like incredibly different positions of power to care for each other. That's something that we should make more of, for sure. And another one is about what I was saying about compartmentalization. So thinking that drug policy reform is a goal in and of itself, rather than a means to. The more I've been involved in drug policy reform and harm reduction, the more I think they are integral to building more sustainable futures for everyone. And so I cannot think of drug policy reform in isolation from climate collapse, capitalist exploitation, patriarchal violence, racism, and racist policing. So I really question any moves and any attempts to make demands that entrench or expand these other systems of violence and neglect. And in this, I'm quite, I guess some would say, dogmatic, like uncompromising. But I think that's just basically an invitation to cultivate solidarity with sister movements and struggles, and thinking what is possible, and how do we work our way back to where we are to get there, rather than these are the laws that we have, how do we tweak them so that they are a little bit better? Like, I think we desperately need a fuller vision of the society that we're proposing, and to be very clear about how drug policy reform and harm reduction contribute to that.
That's beautiful, and it sort of it's quite frustrating that to be a revolutionary has become like a bad thing. It's like it's a bad word. You don't want to be associated with it, because if you're a revolutionary in a drug policy reform movement, then you're seen as, I guess, I don't know, maybe dogmatic, maybe ideological, maybe unrealistic. Like people are like, oh no, we need to, we need to stay focused on, this little tiny change, and that's all we care about. It's like, if we get cannabis legalized, that's kind of what we're in it for. And I'm like, well, really? There are so many like that you just cannot ignore how drug policy reform is just that one ring in like a series of connected rings, and that it shouldn't be compartmentalized away from them. You're right. I completely agree with you. I guess, in relation to what you just said, maybe it would be a good time to talk a little bit about abolitionist futures, and what that's about, and because I think abolition always triggers, the word abolition always triggers really, really strong responses in people, and people are afraid to engage with it, and they shy away from those discussions because they think it's too radical, and so they just don't even want to engage with it. And I think that's a shame. So yeah, tell us something about abolitionist futures.
Yeah, before I go there, I will talk a little bit about how I came to collaborate with Abolitionist Futures. But before that, I just wanted to pick up on something that you say about, like, when we have, like, sometimes people who have different views and views that are perceived as being more radical are deemed like ideologues. And I find it really funny because it suggests that other frames of understanding issues are not an ideology, or are not based on sort of also a collection of assumptions. So yeah, that's just funny to me. So Abolitionist Futures is a group of people who are invested in a future without prisons, without police, and without punishment. I came to know about Abolitionist Futures through a few people, actually, and I think maybe that was the universe pushing me to realize that this space existed. So first, my partner ran a workshop at the International Conference on Penal Abolition, which happened here in London in 2018. And that conference took place under the theme Abolitionist Futures. So that was my first sort of approach, I guess, to Abolitionist Futures. And then also through Imani Mason Jordan, who's a colleague at Release, and just a wonderful thinker and organizer and person in general, and I admire them a lot. And it was in 2019 when Abolitionist Futures ran reading groups in person, and I tried to attend, but I was also in a space in relation to work where I think I still had to learn a little bit about how to create boundaries that made my work sustainable. And at the time I was working in a relatively unsustainable manner. So like incredibly long hours that really made it impossible for me to engage with other stuff. And it wasn't necessarily, I don't think it was sort of imposed from work. Like I actually stayed longer than other of my colleagues in the office. I think it was like a self-imposed sort of unsustainable way of working. And so the pandemic happened then, and these reading groups became online. And so Imani mentioned this to me, and I finally joined a reading group on May 2020, reading group Abolitionist Futures. And that was the same month that we saw the tragedy of George Floyd's murder. So it just felt at a certain point when I was engaging in this reading group that when I looked around, based on my experience in drug policy reform, from my own personal experiences with police and state violence in the shape of violence against people that I loved, from discussions with colleagues from around the world about their own experiences with police harassment and violence, and from the shocking images that we saw also throughout that year, not only from the US, but also from Brazil, from Venezuela, also from Nigeria with the NSARS movement. It was impossible to sort of take all that in and believe that the criminal legal system or any social order based on punishment is ever going to guarantee health and well-being for all. Like, I think that's when sort of any sort of last inkling of trust that I had in the criminal legal system as a means for justice sort of vanished. And so Abolitionist Futures allowed me to connect with people that think and feel differently, but also, and I think this is crucial for me, have started building alternatives within the cracks of this world in order to sort of produce a different world where we relate to each other in a different way. And that was incredibly valuable for me. So Abolitionist Futures shares information and resources, creates spaces for learning, builds a network of existing and emerging abolitionist groups and allied organizations. And the purpose is sort of like, strengthening an abolitionist movement in Britain and in Ireland through events, reading groups, analysis, and resources. So that's sort of how I came to be involved with Abolitionist Futures. Now, when it comes to people's reluctance towards abolition, it's a funny one that you mentioned, fear, because the response that I tend to get the most is actually about people believing that abolitionists are naive, or liberal colleagues have told me like, oh, it's just very idealistic, like very sort of disconnected from reality. And I think this stems from a lack of understanding of what abolition is, and I don't blame them for this, because it's a concept that hasn't been particularly present in the public sphere, I feel, in Britain. I think things have been changing as of late, but maybe not before. I think when people hear about abolition, they think, oh, they want to sort of demolish prisons tomorrow and disappear the police tomorrow. And I have never met someone who is in abolition or is involved in abolition and thinks that this is what needs to happen, because it's just literally impossible. So this is not what abolitionists are proposing. So in relation to that, the first thing that I would say is, if you have questions about abolition, if you do not quite know what it means, join the abolitionist group, Abolitionist Futures reading groups. Like, it's a great opportunity to it's not a reading group for people who already know and feel. I very much feel like I'm still in my infancy when it comes to learning about abolition. So come to the group. It's a space where that we create precisely to make it so that people can question these ideas and share their concerns, and because also of the ethos of abolition, we're not there to sort of like expel people when they say something that sounds a little bit off. Like, we're literally creating these spaces for people to be able to learn, and learning is uncomfortable and a little bit awkward sometimes, but absolutely necessary. So to start responding about what it means and what it means to me, the first thing that I would say is that abolition is not like a ready-made sort of add water and grow at home instant solution to the mess of the world that we live in. Recently, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, an abolitionist thinker and academic, did a talk at the LSE, and she said, abolition is life in rehearsal. It's an invitation to start changing everything and start doing that now. And so while the theory is useful, and very often I get this also from liberal colleagues, oh, it's very academic. You need to have a PhD in Foucault to understand abolition. I think I would say that for most abolitionist theories, they're to inform practice, because abolition is practice and is presence. So how can we, in very concrete and very material terms, advance a world where we can all thrive and we can all fit and no one is treated as disposable? And that is very much about our relationship with other people. So, for example, not walking by when somebody's being stopped and searched by the police, but rather sort of approaching them, making sure that they're okay. Check with the police, why is this person being stopped? What is the grounds for this search? Asking that person if they're okay with us filming the situation, intervening when people are being subjected to harassment and abuse by the police. That is part of everyday practice of abolition. It's people who use drugs coming together to support each other in staying well. This is work that is already happening. It's taking away reasons to from the police to harass our communities, for example, through the decriminalization of drug use and possession and sex work. It is creating community responses to mental health crisis. So if my friend is having a drug-related psychosis episode, we don't call the police, but we try to support our friends ourselves, or create initiatives that do that, to avoid sort of bringing in somebody who will, by somebody I mean the police, who will not be equipped and will probably respond with violence and will probably most likely worsen the situation and lead to that person being sectioned and sort of further violated. It's mobilizing to ensure that people who migrate have safe passage instead of dying in the channel. Like it's so much. It's about building this world. So I want to underscore that abolitionist practice is not sort of like talking about theory or Foucauldian PhDs. But abolition is also an analytical tool to understand structural oppression. And with this, I want to go back to this idea of abolition as naivety, or as sort of idealism without connection to reality, because I think there's an element of condescension in saying that. It's like, oh, you little person who doesn't understand how the world actually works. And I resent that, because abolitionist ideas have been, for a very long time, part of the Black radical tradition. It is informed by the opposition to slavery, and so abolition harks back, like, as a term to the abolition of slavery, which, by the way, wasn't very popular when the movement to abolish slavery was sort of trying to get slavery abolished. It's very much informed by the experiences and by the leadership of Black women, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariam Kaba, and so many more. And also by people who have experience in their own bodies incarceration and exploitation. So it is an analytical tool, but one that exists to subvert oppression and inform anti-oppressive practice. So just to summarize, because I've spoken a lot, to paraphrase Mariam Kaba, abolition is three things at least: a political vision, a world without surveillance and punishment, where no one is treated as disposable; an analytical lens to understand and subvert oppression; and a practical strategy of organizing and recreating community. So that's a little summary, but come to the reading group.
Yeah, that's lovely. I want to come too. I was just thinking about this and how in the UK, we know nothing about it because, or we know little about it, and we're not engaged, and because there isn't as many, I think there haven't been as many people in positions of power within academia that have a direct connection to a history of slavery, have their ancestors been enslaved, have struggled through, because you're right that abolition comes from comes from the history of slavery and people resisting to slavery, and therefore I think in the US there is a much richer tradition, not because there shouldn't be one in the UK, but purely because I think it just happened that some of these women, black women, were able to reach positions of power within academia, in kind of in the kind of advocacy um and kind of like in the struggles for equality and civil rights, and then they created platforms to be able to speak from their experience, whereas I think in the UK these kind of platforms have been lacking, and so that's why we're so distrustful of it as a movement. Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking about it as you were
Yeah,
talking.
and there's definitely, I mean, having people in academy that sort of act as a sounding board, or to that create platforms and spaces for abolitionist ideas to be shared, is definitely very important, and I definitely agree with that point. And in the UK, it may be that historically that hasn't been the case, but today we have academics like or people who bridge the academic and activism world. You have great analysis from people like Koja Koram, like Adam Elliott Cooper, like Gargi Bhattacharya, like Akala, who are bridging that sort of gap that sometimes exists in the UK between sort of activism and academy. But another layer to this is that I think abolitionist ideas have lived and been potentiated by community organizing. And so maybe what has happened to some extent in the UK is that there is a little bit of a disconnect between, or the gap between academy and activism may be a little bit, this is all conjecture, by the way, because I'm not in academy, but maybe there is something to be said about the need for academics to sort of be more connected to active struggles. And like it is encouraging to see, for example, so many academics join the UCU strike. Like I think that speaks to that tradition of sort of worker solidarity being very much alive in academy, but more can be made to connect activism and the UK. And I just wanted to interrogate to a certain extent what you were saying also about the legacy of slavery, because it is not surprising that the thinkers in academy in the UK who I think are most of great guidance in terms of thinking through abolitionist ideas are also people who are have ancestry who were from former colonies. So yeah, I think even though the relationship to slavery of the US and the UK are different, their legacies definitely inform academics whose ancestry did suffer from colonialism and slavery.
I definitely agree. I just think that the UK hasn't acknowledged its history of slavery as much as the US, and therefore that is one big issue. And
Yeah.
of course, there have been amazing academics who, Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, for
Yes,
example, who
of
obviously have
course.
kind of paved the way for for more brilliant minds of contemporaries like Kojo and Adam as well. But it's like, I think on the one hand there is a fear in British academia, especially white dominated kind of British, kind of to let go of that power of setting the cultural discourse, like a la, I don't know, Anthony Giddens, for example. And so there's like all these, it's almost like I feel like in the US there have been, there's been a much more established movement of black strong female academics who have been who have who have so established links with activism and politics on the ground at the grassroots level, that have been occupying positions of power in academia and have therefore built an international reputation, and are now finally considered to be inspiring and credible and so on. And I don't know if I can say the same for female British black academics to the same extent, having reached that. And I'm sure there are many like much inspiring work has been going on. It just hasn't, I just wish that it was, there was more space
Yeah.
for that to reach the peaks that it deserves, and to, and to have that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
um
And
yeah.
and it is a country that, like, and these are sort of my freeform thoughts to a certain extent, because I haven't developed them sufficiently, but I think I have been quite shocked with the what's the word, trust that many in this country have in punishment as a means to deliver justice. Like, for example, if you look at the amount of people who would be okay with the death penalty coming back as a means of the criminal legal system. I haven't checked the numbers recently, but they were sort of about twice the numbers in Spain, and that shocked me. I think there's a lot of work to be done to dismantle these sort of mental structures, and of course in the US it's even worse when it comes to the death penalty. But like, we have been subjected, and when I say we, I mean people in the UK have been subjected to a lifetime and many lifetimes of propaganda to convince us that the criminal legal system delivers justice, and it will take a while to dismantle this, which is why it's so important that people come on board and join the struggle and join this work. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, there's only so many criminologists in criminology departments that can teach students about this stuff. That's not going to reach out into the general public, even though we do tell our criminology students to also talk to their friends and family about the issues that they learn about, injustices that are served by the system day in, day out. So, but yeah, we need definitely more public engagement. And it is scary. Even when students come in, they are very punitive. They are very
Right.
punitive.
I mean,
So
we've been brainwashed from infancy. Like, we were discussing the other day in the reading group, somebody mentioned Paw Patrol, and how, from toddler age, you're told that the police are there to ensure justice, that the police
yeah.
are friendly, that the police are there to support you. And then, I was surprised when I read about the history of policing in this country, how it's integrally linked to the protection of property of enslavers, and integrally connected to colonial rule, not only in Ireland, but also beyond. So I think it's also about, unearthing those histories that we have been told that the police is this normal and natural institution. It is in fact an invention of modern times, and a pretty awful one.
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
like prisons.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so incredible how naturalized it is. And
Yeah.
I remember, again, on the introduction to criminology course, teaching students about, when, going not that far back in history, and they're just all like, what,
Yeah.
prisons are not just like, they haven't always existed, and the police hasn't always
Imagine,
existed. Imagine that.
imagine that.
So yeah. Just to wrap up, I always ask this question to everyone. What is your utopian vision for the future of drug policy?
Oof, this is an exciting one. And it's a hard one, because I think if I really have to think of my utopia, and I'm going to go, as my colleagues say, full-blown idealistic with this one, in my utopia, there aren't states. And so I think I haven't thought of what inverted commas policy means in a borderless, sort of stateless, socialist world. Um, and I think many of the challenges that we face today with or in relation to drugs would disappear in this utopia, because in this utopia there isn't, or we have managed to undo to a significant extent, capitalism, carcerality, racism, ableism, patriarchal violence. And so the harms that we think today are caused by drugs, and that I believe are mostly caused by these intersecting systems of oppression, will have reduced significantly. So this is a world where drug-related harm has reduced dramatically. Um, I think in this world, no one is using drugs in desperation or in precariousness, because no one is houseless and everyone has access to meet their needs, and opportunities to contribute to other people's lives, not because of coercion. And so I think in my utopia there isn't wage labor, but out of communities caring for each other and valuing interdependence. So the majority of people in this utopia are doing things that are rewarding to them and are of service to others, not because they need to survive and get a salary, but because they actually care about what they're doing. Um, this would include growing and producing drugs. So some people organize to grow cannabis or coffee or opium together, for instance. But people come and go of these initiatives and they don't last forever. So some of these cooperatives are very well known and have lasted for a while. Others will be shorter lived. Some of these cooperatives will share the product of the work with other people who use drugs. Some are just self-providing. So it's a very sort of, I don't want to say messy, but like quite organic world. In this world, if somebody causes harm, their communities will mobilize to address this harm. This harm is not going to be privatized or addressed in a way that is externalizing. So it's not like you call an external force like the police or the criminal legal system to fix this harm, but rather the community mobilizes to address this harm. So this could take the shape of ideas that are being developed today around transformative justice, so creating spaces for dialogue and for reflection, for healing and for accountability, commitments and clear measures to ensure that these harms are not repeated, exploration of the reasons why this harm was caused in the first place, and all while centering the needs of people who have been harmed. So there's no policing, no stops, no arrests, detentions, mental health sectioning, incarceration. They're all just like, as you said, as we alluded to before, they're just a distant memory of something awful that happened in the past. In this world, in this utopia, there's no one's premature death is insignificant. So premature death is not normalized as it is today. Like if we look at the numbers of like 100,000 people dying of overdose deaths in the US alone, and this sort of not prompting sort of like an urgent emergency to change how things are, that is the normalization of premature death. In my utopia, that's not the case. Human life is appreciated and celebrated. And so when someone dies of an overdose, there are significant efforts dedicated to explore why that happened and make sure that that doesn't happen again. No one's drug use is stigmatized or belittled. There's no hierarchies of drug use. And any meanings and functions that drug use have in our lives are all considered legitimate and not sort of made into a hierarchy. In my utopia, people care about each other and create the conditions that allow for easy and free access to multiple forms of guidance and healing if their drug use is becoming harmful or difficult. Yeah, these are some of my thoughts about this utopia.
It's beautiful. It's so beautiful. I want all the same things. Can we just go now, please?
Let's go there. I mean, this is another thing that I very often tell my colleagues. Like, I think sometimes I can be quite harsh in my criticism of how we do things now, because I'm so desperate to see this utopia, and I also realize that I will never see it, because it's quite far. But my frustration is very much anchored in the fact that we could have this. Like we could create the conditions to ensure that everyone thrives, and we don't, and that is so frustrating. And that's why it's so urgent that we all get involved in making this happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, I think it's also important to have, leaders in advocacy and activism in academia, in all sectors that are, that are idealistic enough and that think in utopian terms in order to be able to think about change, to think about other ways for what is possible, because otherwise if we only have the realists and we're just going to get stuck in the same place forever.
Just keep having the Tories and parties that just do the exact same thing all over again. There's, I think, is it Audre Lorde who said the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house.
Yeah.
That is something to live with and through.
Yeah. Here. This was a really heartwarming conversation for me, and so I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, and hopefully I know that people will find it interesting and engaging, and I'm just so thankful and for you for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you, Juan.
Oh, thank you so much, Julia. This was absolutely lovely. It's great to be in touch, and yeah, this is we need more people to be involved in this movement and this struggle. So let's keep making these connections happen.
Absolutely, and then I will share information about abolitionist futures as well as IDPC, and all of that will be in the podcast blurb. So watch out for that. And thank you again, Juan.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.